Eritrean soldiers have been accused of killing hundreds of Ethiopian civilians in a 24-hour massacre late last year. Amnesty International is saying the attack on the city of Aksum came as Ethiopian federal forces retook the capital of the Tigray region after a deadly battle. And as Malcolm Webb reports, the killings might amount to a crime against humanity.
Eritrean and Ethiopian forces began their attack on the town of Aksum with indiscriminate shelling, according to rights group Amnesty International. It's released these videos and a report. It says on the 28th of November last year, Tigrayan militia and civilians tried to fight back. Some of them armed with only sticks and stones, attacking Eritrean soldiers on this hill. It says the militia failed and the reprisals were brutal. According to dozens of testimonies, Amnesty says Eritrean troops came into the town and executed hundreds of civilian men and teenage boys. This video shows the body of one of them.
People describe harrowing scenes of people running and being shot in the back, or people being, lined up one behind the other and executed by Eritrean soldiers. Eritrean soldiers shot and killed hundreds of civilians in the city over the course of over 24 hours. They shot people on the streets with sniper rifles and machine guns, people who were running away, and they also, carried out summary executions of men. And then they went house to house looking for adult and teenage men. The massacre took place in retaliation for an attempt by a small group of pro-TPLF fighters to attack an Eritrean base on a mountain in the middle of the city. And in retaliation for this attack, Eritrean forces shot wantonly at civilians and killed, we believe, hundreds of people over the course of roughly 24 hours. They also went around carrying house-to-house searchers and dragging mostly men out of their homes and shooting them on the streets or killing them in their homes. So this is really the main finding of our research. We've also documented indiscriminate shelling during the attack on the city by the joint Ethiopian and Eritrean forces on the 19th of November, as well as arbitrary mass detentions by Eritrean forces of civilians in the aftermath of the massacre, with clear threats to resume the killing in the event of new resistance. And we've also documented widespread and seemingly systematic looting by Eritrean forces of civilian property.
Until now, there hasn't been really confirmation about who the perpetrators are. You mentioned the trigger of this massacre that you're talking about. Did I hear you say Eritrean base in the Tigray region?
Yes, so after the joint force of Ethiopian and Eritrean soldiers entered the city on the 19th of November, Eritrean soldiers set up a base in a school which on this mountain which overlooks a city called Maikuho. And this is where the fighting took place in the morning of the 28th of November. And it's unclear how long the fighting started, but witnesses describe very trained Eritrean soldiers routing the fighters on the other side. Many actually men from Aksum joined the fight with sticks and rocks and were shot with through sniper rifles and machine guns.
What is the government of Ethiopia saying about this? Has there been any admission and action? You mentioned also about looting. One of the key information that we've been learning is that humanitarian food has been either looted or not being able to pass through to get to vulnerable people. If you could share a little bit about who is actually looting humanitarian aid and why is it not getting into the hands of vulnerable people who are basically, on the verge of starvation.
So we've shared our findings. We shared our findings with the Ambassador Redwan Hussein, the State Minister of Foreign Affairs, And at the time of writing, we hadn't received a response. We still haven't received a response from the Ethiopian government. So we don't know what the Ethiopian government has done to address these abuses. To address the question of looting, the looting, as I mentioned, was widespread and systematic. Eritrean forces looted hotels, factories, homes, government buildings, hospitals, shops, storage of food, and they also looted all sorts of objects, machinery, including water pumps and, bakery equipment and generators. They looted, cooking oil, lentils, flour. They looted valuables in, jewelry shops. They looted medication in the hospitals, according to witnesses. So it was very widespread and systematic. And so we call on UN-led investigation into these crimes. As you know, in international humanitarian law, indiscriminate attacks and deliberate attacks on civilians are war crimes. And the shelling, so the shelling of the city in the initial attack would fit these definitions. And in international humanitarian law, when attacks against civilians are widespread and systematic, they're crimes against humanity. And it seems pretty clear from the witnesses that the attack on civilians on the 28th and the 29th of November by Eritrean forces was a deliberate attempt to subdue any resistance in the city by terrorizing the population. And another evidence for that is the mass detention of civilians by the Eritrean forces in the aftermath of the massacre, and the very explicit threat that Eritrean officers made of renewing the killing in the events of new resistance. So we call on the UN-led investigation into these events. We also call on the Ethiopian government to grant unfettered access to Tigray, not only to humanitarian organizations, but also to human rights and media organizations.
Eritrean troops fighting in Ethiopia's Tigray state systematically killed hundreds of unarmed civilians in the northern city of Aksum on the 28th and the 29th of November 2020. An Amnesty International report reveals that troops opened fire in the streets and conducted house-to-house raids in a massacre that may amount to a crime against humanity. Joining us now is Joanne Mariner, Director of Crisis Response at Amnesty International. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time tonight. Now, your report describes a massacre on the 28th as well as the 29th of November in Aksum. How and why did this happen?
It happened after Eritrean and Ethiopian forces took the city of Aksum, which had been in the control of Tigrayan forces. And they had been in the city for approximately 10 days and had carried out some atrocities even prior to the massacre. There had been extrajudicial executions of people suspected of supporting or belonging to Tigrayan forces. There had been massive looting. But what sparked the massacre itself was the morning that it took place, there was an attack on a base held by Eritrean troops. So pro-TPLF forces mounted an attack on the base, and they got some support, mostly sort of moral support from local youth, who were cheering them on or who came along, with sticks and stones. So that attack was successfully repelled. But in retaliation, they just went across the city and really went on the rampage. They deliberately shot civilians in the street, and we have, multiple testimonies of groups of people being killed together. And then they went house to house, and they searched for men. If you were a woman, they left you alone. They didn't kill you. But men, they pulled out and they extrajudicially executed on the spot. So in all, hundreds of civilians were killed. And we also interviewed numerous people who were involved in picking up the bodies in the following days and burying them. And we have accounts of hundreds of people, and we actually have the name of over 241 people who were killed.
Give us a bit of background to this, Joanne. There have been ongoing conflicts between the Ethiopian government as well as forces aligned to TPLF. What is the main objective here? Why do these conflicts actually exist?
Well, I mean, the TPLF obviously was the governing party and was engaged in its own armed conflict with Eritrea over, a very bloody, very, horrific conflict that lasted a long time. So you have long-standing rivalry and, I would say hatred on both sides. But now what you had was the Ethiopian government, I think, deciding to, well, there was apparently a TPLF effort to take over Ethiopian bases within Tigray, but that has led to the Ethiopian government deciding to basically beat the TPLF, and to do so, it seems that they need the assistance of Eritrean forces. So, we have testimonies not just from Aksum, but from different cities across the region that there are areas where, in fact, the Eritrean forces are by far the majority or even the only forces holding territory. They're very clearly, despite the denials of both the Eritrean and the Ethiopian government, they're very clearly an active player in this conflict.
Tell us, after the killings, you mentioned there that people were actually allowed to go into the streets and take the bodies of their loved ones and bury them. With hundreds being buried around St. Mary's of Zion Church. What was that like for the residents of Aksum?
Initially, people weren't allowed, and there were actually people who tried to go out and bury bodies and were themselves shot. And apparently they were told by soldiers, we've lost our members, so, you get to suffer too. But then the elders negotiated with the Eritrean forces, and finally it was accepted that they could pick the bodies off the street and bury them. This happened actually during what was normally a large celebration. It's a religious holiday on November 30th, but instead you had mass burials. Instead of celebrating, you had mass sadness, terrible despair. Hundreds of people dead, hundreds of people's relatives, brothers and sisters and family members dead. So it was, it is either the worst or one of the very worst atrocities that have happened so far in this conflict. And it was a terrible tragedy for the city.
Tell us more about the findings that you made during this investigation, as well as the type of challenges that you came across.
Well, one of the, really obvious challenges is the government has not granted access to human rights organizations to do investigations on the ground. And there was also, from, much of the time, there's been a phone and internet cutoff. So we don't, have much access to people in Aksum. What we did was we went to Eastern Sudan, where you had, quite a large outflow of tens of thousands of Ethiopian refugees, including quite a number from Aksum, even though, the trip is really onerous, but we still managed to speak to 41 witnesses during 2 trips to Eastern Sudan, and a number of people who we later spoke to on the ground, especially after, when communications became possible. And then what we did was we also corroborated our witness testimonies, or cross-checked our witness testimonies with satellite imagery and with digital evidence that we were able to gather. So there have been some videos that have now managed to slip out, and there's satellite imagery showing, for example, the looting, showing the mass graves, showing what looks like evidence of indiscriminate shelling. So, using kind of a range of different methodologies, we were able to come to, I think, very firm conclusions about this massacre.
Now, there have been some reports coming out of both Ethiopia and Eritrea with a denial that Eritrean forces were actually involved in this massacre. Also, even the information minister of Eritrea questioning the report that you have put together, saying that you are biased against Eritrea. What are your comments regarding that?
We just have the evidence is so strong, and it's a mix of witness testimonies, and the witnesses are, interviewed in a way that's meant to test what they say. We interview people individually, we interview them in detail, and we cross-check what they tell us with others, and we cross-check it with satellite imagery, with digital imagery. So I think, it's actually beyond dispute that there are Eritrean forces operating in Ethiopia, and we are absolutely convinced of the fact that this massacre occurred. I think if the government wants to assess the truth more deeply, it should invite international investigators in, whatever investigators it would consider unbiased. We're recommending UN investigators, and give them access to actually, those mass graves can be exhumed. Witnesses can be interviewed. It's a large city. There are thousands of people who could be interviewed. So we would welcome a further investigation of these claims.
As we end off, Joanne, what does Amnesty International want to happen now?
Most urgently, we would like this kind of atrocity to stop taking place. And we know we have further testimonies about, smaller scale, but killings in remote villages. The kind of looting that we saw in Aksum taking place on a smaller scale across the region. I think the Ethiopian government needs to take steps to rein in Eritrean forces. The perpetrators of this kind of abuse need to be prosecuted, and the first responsibility for that is on the Ethiopian government. And the international community, particularly the African Union and influential states in Africa, need to be putting pressure on both the Eritrean and the Ethiopian government to take steps to stop this kind of horrific violence.
Joanne, thank you very much for your time, as well as that investigative report that was put together by Amnesty International. That's Joanne Mariner, Director of Crisis Response at Amnesty International.